Dr. Nardi here, back with another video. And in this video, we're going to talk about the IRB and, well, what the heck is it and why does it exist? All right, let's talk about the IRB. So the IRB is basically the institutional review board that any college, university, anywhere that's collecting federal money has to have an IRB board. And basically what they're in charge of is protecting human subjects. So they are there to protect the human subjects of any research that goes on in the university or organization, because there was a lot of misuses in the past, which we'll talk about. And basically, the IRB has jurisdiction over the research proposed by any member of that institution. Now, the other thing that comes up in your book is the Belmont Report. And this was a federal report issued by the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of a Biomedical and Behavioral Research. Now, this was published in 1979. And basically what it did was outline principles that guide the ethical treatment of research subjects. And the part we're interested in is Title 45, Part 46 of the Code of Federal Relations. And this is the federal code that governs the protection of human subjects. And we'll talk more about this as we move on in this video. So the Belmont Report is really about an ethical statement when working with human subjects, how you act ethically. And it gives directions on how to protect human subjects. That's very, very important. You always want to assess the risk-benefit criteria. You always want the benefits to outweigh the risks. It also creates guidelines for selecting human subjects. Who can you include, who you can include. It also talks about monitoring and evaluating the work. That's part of what the IRB does, is monitor and evaluate the work of research going on. It also helps you as a researcher create informed consent guidelines, especially when you're working with vulnerable populations such as children, prisoners, or those who might be institutionalized with cognitive impairments. There's a whole nother level of protection for vulnerable populations. And what the Belmont Report really kind of puts forth is 3 ethical principles. It's respect for persons. So they emphasize people are autonomous agents. And that's why you have to use informed consent, because you have to let them know what you're doing. And there are cases for deception, which we'll talk about a little bit later. The other thing is you have to emphasize doing no harm, or as I said earlier, maximizing benefits while minimizing risk. That is the old goal, right? And the last one is justice. And you have to emphasize the fair distribution of the risk and rewards for the participation in your study, right? So you have to be very, very fair related to the risk and rewards. So in the past, there's been some, tradition of oversight. For example, the Nuremberg Code. This consisted of 10 guidelines for the ethical treatment of human subjects. And this code was really solidified in 1949. And it actually emerged out of what happened with the Nazis and the war crimes. What was the substance of these 10 points? Basically, they said voluntary consent is critical. So you had to have people voluntarily consent to be in your study. The research should be beneficial to society and not be procurable in any other way. A knowledge base from animal studies or the literature should suggest that the likely results could justify the experiment. So they want no unnecessary physical or mental suffering or injury should be involved. No research should occur if there is any prior knowledge that death or disabling may occur. So, if you think someone should die, don't do the research. They also said the degree of risk should never outweigh the importance of what's being learned. And every precaution should be taken to prevent even the remote possibility of injury, disability, or death. They also added that only only scientifically qualified individuals should conduct experiments. Subjects should have the right to stop participating if they have reached a physical or mental state where they judge it impossible to continue. And scientists must be prepared to stop the research if the judgment continuing presents the risk of injury, disability, or death to the subject. Another study that comes up in research is the Tuskegee syphilis study. And this was a study of African American men with syphilis that demonstrated basically a lot of violations of ethical principles because the men were left untreated when a treatment was available. They wanted to see what would happen with syphilis, so they didn't treat these men, which is awful. Interestingly enough, it was actually sponsored by the United States Public Health Services, and this ran from 1932 to 1972. Another study that comes up, and you might have learned about this in an early psychology course, is Milgram's obedience to authority study. And if you remember, this study basically, by the way, is unethical. You can't do it now. Was conducted at Yale, and it was basically consisted of people in two roles, either the teacher or the learner. And the learners were Confederates, meaning they were in on the study, and the teachers were participants. And what Milgram was really interested in how far or what to the extent will people are willing to go to administer electric shock to individuals, especially when the learners incorrectly answered the question. And the learners actually did incorrectly answer the question. And the participants often thought they were really shocking individuals, but they weren't. But the learners would act as if they were being shocked. And interestingly enough, more than 80% of the teachers continued administering the shocks, even, when the questions were incorrectly answered. And even after they heard the learners crying, they kept going. Another one that pops up is Zimbardo's prison experiment. And this is another unethical study. And this took place in Stanford. And basically, he took men, college age, and he divided them up into prisoner or guards. And he basically simulated a prison. And he wanted to see how people would act. How would people treat each other when they were put into the two roles? How did the social roles influence their behavior? And the situation deteriorated so quickly that the experiment had to be shut down early. So the fake prison was supposed to run for about 2 weeks. Unfortunately, they had to shut it down so early because a lot of the prisoners became acutely emotionally agitated. So he had to end it early. Another unethical study that we can cite is Kennedy and the Institute lead paint study. And basically, this took place in Baltimore, Maryland. And it was actually conducted by Johns Hopkins University and funded by the EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Agency, and that exposed some children to lead paint. They wanted to know what happens when children are exposed to lead paint. And this basically focused on lead paint-based abatement and the repair and maintenance. That's what they were looking at. And they wanted to kind of figure out the effectiveness of different steps to rid the house of toxic lead. And a lot of lawsuits were filed related to this research. And when you think about it now, we actually call this research non-therapeutic because it offered the prospects no direct benefits, right? No direct benefits to the children. Actually, it was harmful. And actually, the Court of Appeals in Maryland stated that a parent, appropriate relative, or the appropriate surrogate cannot consent to the participation of a child or other person under legal disability in a non-therapeutic research study or in studies in which there is risk of injury, damage, or health or damage of health to the subject. And this ruling marked the first time in the U.S. court system that the Nuremberg Code that we talked about earlier was actually adopted. Now, as psychology students, or if you're in the field of psychology or social sciences, we go by the APA Code of Ethics. And the APA is the American Psychological Association, and they have 10 standards. They have 10 standards that guide psychological experiments and psychologists in general. And you'll notice that these principles, these 10 principles they have, overlap the Belmont Report. So they say that you need to do no harm or inflict the least harm possible. You need to operate in your area of competence. So you should do research that you're competent to conduct. You need to respect people and their rights and dignity. And you need to ensure that there's integrity and justice. And if you're going to publish your research, you probably want to look at Standard 8, the research and publication part. So if you go on to grad school, PhDs, if you're in one now, you want to make sure that you include informed consent, right? You have to be explicit to the participants what the research is about, what's the expected duration, what the procedure is. You have to give them the right to decline to participate in your study or withdraw from the study at any time. You have to tell them what the foreseeable consequences of declining or withdrawing are. You have to see any reasonably foreseen factors that may be expected to influence their willingness to participate, such as potential risks, discomfort, or adverse effects. And you have to tell them about any research benefits. You also have to inform them about the limited or the limits of confidentiality. You have to let them know about the incentives for participation. And you also have to let them know who to contact for questions about the research and the research participants' rights. So you have to include all of this in your informed consent form. So what are some considerations you have to make when you think about collecting your data? So there are considerations. For example, not all data collection is research, and not all subjects are human. Sometimes we work with animals in psychology, and that has its own separate protection. So you might say, well, there's a lot of stuff here that requires IRB approval, but if you're working with individuals, what doesn't require IRB approval? And actually, some things don't. Scholarly or journalistic activities. For example, if you're just doing an oral history, journalism, or legal or historical scholarship, you do not need IRB approval. Public health surveillance activities, like the collection or information or biospecimens to investigate the onset or outbreak of a disease or natural event that threatens public health, does not need IRB approval. Information, biospecimens, or records, those authorized by law or court ordered necessary for criminal justice procedures, do not need IRB approval. Operational activities, those authorized by agencies dealing with homeland security, intelligence, defense, or national security activities, do not need IRB approval. So what is the fundamental purpose of the IRB? What is the fundamental duty? And that's the review of research and the record keeping and the documenting of that review. So what do you need to do to be a member of this committee? Well, the regulations stipulate at least 5 people are on the committee with varying kinds of expertise, and at least 1 member of the committee must come from the community. You need a review level expert. There's actually different review levels as well. So we have exempt, expedited, and full. Exempt research, low risk. Research does not need to undergo IRB review once determination by the self or others that it meets the qualifying criteria. Expedited research, a minimal risk that undergoes limited IRB, typically carried out by IRB chair or IRB members. It's designated by the chair. Again, that's minimal risk. And full approval basically involves more than minimal risk and or categories of subjects such as children or prisoners. So if you work with children or prisoners, you need to go to a much more extensive full review of your research. What are some other terms you should know? Intervention includes both physical procedures by which information or biospecimens are gathered, and manipulations of the subject or subject's environment that are performed for research purposes. Interaction includes communication or interpersonal contact between investigator and subject. Benign behavioral intervention, brief in duration, harmless, painless, not physically invasive, not likely to have a significant adverse lasting impact on the subjects, and the interventions will not be thought of as offensive or embarrassing. Secondary research, there's another term you need to know. Research using information or biospecimens in a project after the originally were conducted or gathered. Broad consent is another term you should know. This permits the use of subjects identify information or biospecimens in future for the secondary research purposes. There's also two forms of deception. There's passive deception, right? This is deception through admission, and active deception. This is deception through commission. You should also know about deception is the contribution of the American Psychological Association, or the GIST principle 8.07. And basically, that says that deception should not be used in studies that involve physical or significant emotional pain. And you also should be worried if there's any carryover, emotional or otherwise, from the deception you use. And you also think about the drawbacks, if there's any drawbacks to deception, and maybe if there's any way you don't have to use deception. So what do we include in the IRB proposal? Basically, you give the nature of the proposal, what's it about, what's the topic, what's the study about, who are the participants, how old are the participants, how many participants are you going to have, are any of your participants underage, are any of them part of a vulnerable population, how many participants are you going to recruit, what's the number of participants you need, and then lay out exactly the procedure you're going to use. You also want to include your instruments. What are they exactly? Give them a copy, maybe give them an electronic link. You also want to do an informed consent. You have to be very clear on exactly what you're going to write to your participants and let them know that they're participating in the study. You also have to make sure how you're going to protect the confidentiality of your research participants and how you're going to maintain them being anonymous. These are the two really important pieces here, is confidentiality and making sure they're anonymous. You also want to note if you're using deception, and if you are, you have to justify why. You also have to tell them if there's going to be a debriefing, and if there's not, you have to tell them why. And then finally, you have to give them a copy of the informed consent. And the purpose of the informed consent is the subject must be provided with the information in order to make an informed decision about whether to participate and the opportunity to discuss that information. And when you give them these informed consent, you have to basically let them know, right, if there's any risks. You have to tell them about the study, give them the background of the study. You have to let them know if they can decline to participate at any time, they could stop participation at any time. There'll be no negative adverse consequences to them. You also have to let them know if there's any benefit to them. Like, are they going to get anything? There might not be, by the way. You also have to let them know if there's any risks to them participating. And you also have to let them know how you'll maintain them being anonymous and keeping their data confidential, and how you protect that information. And you also, and this is more clinical stuff, but you have to let them know in situations where confidentiality might be broken. So for example, if you're giving them, this is a suicidal ideation questionnaire, and they note in the questionnaire that they're suicidal. Unfortunately, you have to break that confidentiality to get them help, right? So you have to get them help. You're duty bound, especially in clinical settings. And you also, there are specific times where you can waive informed consent. And we won't go too far in this video, but usually you can waive it if there's minimal risk involved and there's no practicable way to conduct the information or collect the information. You have to make sure that no adverse effects would be resulting if you're altering or waiving the informed consent as well. And last but not least, you can always obtain that informed consent electronically. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.